Chapter 12. The Best. At the Arsenal Club in Toledo, Ohio, Mustang Sally played out loudly. The music was coming from big speakers, not a live band. Over the stage at the front of the club, a large banner was hanging that read, "Wet T-shirt contest every night." But T-shirt had been crossed out, and G-string had been painted on in its place. An attempt by the owners to attract more customers. Sure enough, up on the stage a few women with fake breasts, wearing nothing but hats, cowboy boots, and the promised G-strings, gyrated for the clientele. A group of Marines were in town on some joint venture with the Coast Guard up on Lake Erie, and had picked the Arsenal as their venue of choice for their evening's entertainment. They were sat under the raised platform below the stage, and had toy Uzi water pistols filled with booze. They were spraying the women excitedly every time they got close enough. Wade Garrett watched from his chosen space by the dank bar, his experienced eyes taking everything in, despite his relaxed stance and wandering mind. He sighed internally, reflecting on how he'd ended up in a dive like this. There had been a time when Garrett was the best there was in this game, his name known far and wide. He used to joke that men wanted to be him and women wanted to be with him, only it hadn't been a joke. The constant edge of violence that follows a bouncer was somehow appealing to both sexes, only in different ways. Women, well, a certain type of woman at least, found something about the whole thing sexy. Wade had never had an issue finding someone to take home at the end of a shift, and back then, in some of the most high-profile clubs in the likes of LA, New York and Chicago, the women had been some real beauties too. But a lot of men used to spend their evenings offering to buy him drinks as well, regaling him with their exaggerated stories of fights they'd had in the past, and apparently always won handily, in some vain attempt to impress him. Garrett had never understood it. What did they expect him to do? Say, "Well, shit, you're clearly the baddest motherfucker in town. Here's my paycheck and the keys to the club. The rest is up to you." Booze, bikes, bars, and bad women had been Garrett's life in those years. He shook his head as he remembered how young he'd once been. How stupid. And still he smiled at the thought that he wouldn't have changed one bit of it. Well, he thought, as he stretched out his leg, there was one thing he'd like to have gone back to change. One late night, about 6 or 7 years back, he'd been stood on the door having a smoke at the end of a long night, talking to a couple of female admirers and trying to decide if he preferred the blonde or the redhead, when a scream from the mostly empty parking lot nearby had drawn his attention. It was a woman's scream, one born of anger more than fear, and when he'd looked over, he'd seen a young girl, and what he assumed had been her boyfriend, arguing by a battered old pickup truck. Domestics like this weren't unusual, but when the boyfriend stepped towards the girl and cracked her with a right hand that was hard enough to send her sprawling into the dirt, even the desensitized Garrett had felt a little shocked. The blonde and the redhead had watched too, their jaws literally dropping at the sheer violence of the scene. As one, they turned to him, their eyes asking, "What are you gonna do about this?" "Ah, shit," Garrett had grumbled, as he decided then that he'd have to intervene. He'd put down the bottle of beer he'd been sipping onto a nearby wall and pushed open the door back into the club. He was about to holler inside for some support when he'd remembered that it was Dalton's night off. His young protege was about the only one on the team he'd trusted to watch his back, so he reluctantly let the door close. "I guess it's mano y mano," he'd said to the watching ladies as he'd headed over to the truck. When Garrett had got there, the boyfriend, a 6-footer that weighed about 250 pounds, was dragging the semi-conscious girl roughly to her feet. "Look what you made me do!" he shouted at her as he leaned her up against the truck. I'm sorry," the girl had muttered weakly through a bloody lip. "Save the apologies, honey," Garrett had interjected, mostly to get the man's attention, which it did. "Who the fuck are you?" the boyfriend had asked. "I'm the guy telling you it's time to go home," Garrett had told him. The aggressive man hadn't even bothered to come up with anything else to say. Instead, he just swung a big right hand. Garrett had been fast back in those days. He'd bobbed off to one side and thrown a left hook that had shoveled into the other man's ribs and driven the air right out of him. He'd fallen forward coughing, somehow making it about 20 feet before he finally collapsed onto his hands and knees. "Don't hurt him!" The girl had shouted at Garrett. "Sure," Garrett had said as he'd opened the door to the pickup and peered in. The keys had been dangling there in the ignition. "Take yourself home, okay?" Please don't hurt him," the girl had pleaded in response, as Garrett had sat her in behind the wheel. "It's not his fault." "I ain't gonna hurt him," Garrett had said to her as he'd shut the truck's door. "Too bad," he concluded under his breath as he turned to his now rising opponent. "You're gonna fucking pay for that," the drunk boyfriend had promised, pointing a meaty hand at Garrett. "Listen, muchacho," Garrett had tried to reason with him. "There's no need for this to get any worse. I can't stop you being a low-down piece of shit, but you can't do it here." Garrett had heard the rumble of the pickup truck's engine behind him. At least you won't have to deal with this asshole tonight, he'd thought as, once again, the big drunk had decided that words were a waste of time. This time Garrett had used his boxing, stopping his approaching foe with a stiff jab to the jaw, followed up with a right and a left straight. "Had enough yet?" Garrett had asked as the other man had stumbled backward. He'd held one hand over his face, and Garrett remembered seeing blood running through his fingers from his busted nose. He remembered thinking that the big guy could take a punch, and that it might be time to stop going easy on him. He remembered wondering why everything had got so bright in front of him all of a sudden. He didn't remember much after that. Apparently, the girl had decided that she'd needed to protect her abusive boyfriend and had driven the truck into Garrett, knocking him out cold and onto the floor, before backing it out of the parking lot, running right over his leg in the process. Garrett had learnt all of this from Dalton when he finally woke up a few days later, his arm and leg in a cast, unable to move for the pain. The kid had been the only one to come and visit him in the hospital during his 2-month stay. That alone had been something to give Garrett pause for thought. Your real friends are the ones who are there for you in the worst of times. And he'd quickly found out that for all the admirers and ass-kissers he'd been surrounded with, he only really had one true friend in all the world. What a life he'd lived. It had been a few more months until he was able to get back to work, but he was never the same, and by then they were already calling Dalton the best. Garrett had known then that his time on top was over. Part of him had been angry at how it had all gone down. Part of him was still angry about it. But another part of him conceded that everyone gets replaced in the end, even if they're not ready for it. It's just a matter of time and circumstance. Dalton saw himself as some sort of fighting philosopher and had read something to Garrett during his recuperation. A famous old Japanese warrior had apparently once said, "Truth is not what you want it to be." That had stuck with Garrett, and he guessed it was true. "Charge!" came a good-hearted shout from one of the soldiers by the stage, followed by encouraging chants and loud laughter from the rest of the group. The noise brought Garrett fully back to his senses, and he headed over as quick as his gammy left leg would allow. He arrived just as one of the jarheads was attempting to get up onto the stage after one of the girls. He grabbed the soldier by the shoulders and yanked him back down onto his seat. "Take it easy, Rambo," he told the shaven-headed youngster, an easy grin breaking out on his grey stubbled face. "I know you want to save the world from the commies, but you're gonna have to do it down here, man." The Marines' buddies started to laugh. They broke into a chant of, "Squirt him! Cool him off! Get him!" and opened up mercilessly with the water pistols on their reprimanded friend. Garrett winked to the girl up on the stage and headed back to his position. As he went, someone behind the bar shouted over to him. "Garrett, yo!" he called, waving a big black phone receiver. "Some guy, name of Dalton." Garrett's face lit up with a genuine smile as he limped to the phone. "What's going on, mijo?" he asked happily down the receiver. He hadn't spoken to the kid for a week, hadn't actually seen him in person since that thing in Memphis a year back, but theirs was the sort of friendship that could just pick up, no matter the time or the distance. Hey, how you doing, buddy?" Dalton responded. There was a rumbling noise in the background that reminded Garrett of a laundrette. "Oh shit, hell kid, I'm in hog heaven," he joked, glancing around at the rough-looking bikers playing pool behind him. "If I was doing any better, I couldn't live with myself. How about you?" "I'm all right," Dalton answered curtly after a moment. "You're good?" Garrett said. "By God, you ought to be, all that money you're making, right?" The kid didn't respond. "What's going on in Jasper?" he asked, letting Dalton know that he had paid attention during their last conversation. "Nah, you know," Dalton said. "New town, same story." He paused and took a deep breath, then approached the real reason he'd called. Listen, you ever heard of a guy named Brad Wesley?" Garrett thought for a moment, but the name rang no bells. "No, can't say that I have," he answered. It's not like the kid to ask a question like that, he thought. He wondered who this Wesley character was, and why Dalton wanted to know. "You having trouble?" he asked, straight up. Nothing I'm not used to," Dalton answered solemnly. "But it's amazing what you can get used to, huh?" he added with a chuckle. Garrett laughed back, but he'd heard the notes of concern in the younger man's voice just before he turned on the humor. "Yeah, tell me about it," he played along. "This place has a sign hanging over the urinal that says, 'Don't eat the big white mint.'" He enjoyed hearing Dalton laugh in return. He was on the other end of the phone and half a country away, but it reminded him of late nights they'd spent together in dark bar rooms, patching up their wounds. There was a commotion behind Garrett, and he turned to see the beginnings of a fight between two different groups of bikers at the pool tables. Nobody was swinging cues yet, but he knew they would be soon enough, if he didn't stop them. "Stay cool, kid," he said to Dalton, sad to have to end the conversation so soon. "Right," said Dalton. "Gotta go," Garrett told him. "I'll see you later." As he hung up the phone and headed over to deal with the rowdy combatants, he couldn't help but feel like there was something the kid wasn't telling him. Like he needed his help.